Okay, so to begin watercolor painting, you'll need to do it on watercolor paper. And one way that you can know that your paper is watercolor paper is that it will be thicker. If you feel it, it will feel thicker than maybe your drawing paper or just regular notebook paper. And if you look closely at it, it'll look textured. Okay, so to begin using your watercolors, you'll be able to use, since they're in the tubes, they're going to be really concentrated colors. And so you'll want to just use a little bit at a time. And you'll squeeze some out onto some sort of surface. I am just using wax paper. And you are able to mix these like you are with other paints. Just maybe start out with small amounts. So this one's the blue. And I'm gonna squeeze just the tiniest bit out. Smaller than my pinky nail. And so watercolor paints, although that these do come out as a liquid, we need water to sort of really get them going. So I wetted my paintbrush with some water, and I'm gonna sort of just start to add water. And see, that's a really deep concentrated blue. And so there's a couple, there's two sort of basic ways that we can add watercolor to our paper. So one way we can do it is dry to wet. So we can keep our paper dry, but make sure that our paintbrush is wet. So the first one I'm going to show you is dry on wet. So my paper is dry, but my paintbrush is wet. And so we're getting that really nice, bright, rich color. Is wet on wet. So what I mean by wet on wet is I will take my paintbrush, I swished it around in my water and made sure that it was clean. And so then I'm going to put water down on my paper first. I'm going to wet my paper. And then I'm going to take a little bit of that paint and then sort of touch. And see how that color sort of immediately spread out? Because there was already that water on the paper to help sort of guide it. So if you wanted to, you could draw a shape with just a wet paintbrush, and then if you just take a dab and then tap it, your color would spread out. And so one other sort of basic watercolor technique I want to show you is ways that we can start to begin to add value, right? So the less water we have, the more concentrated or the brighter our paint will be. So if I start with one area and I have that really dark, rich blue, I could dip my paintbrush back into my water and then sort of just begin to brush that out. I'm not adding any more paint to my paintbrush. I am just using the water to help thin that color out and make it lighter. And when you are using this, depending on how much water you are using, you'll want to be careful to leave your paper flat on your desk or on your table, because if you pick it up, your colors might run if there are large pools of water. So now I'm just adding sort of a little bit more paint around that edge to sort of really darken up that area. But I'm not adding any more paint to this area. I'm still just leaving it where I drag it out with my paintbrush. And so one more thing I want to show you before I start to talk about maybe the special techniques and different ways you can work with watercolor is blending the colors. So I put a little bit of red on my wax paper, and I still have that blue there. So I'm gonna drag some of that red out, and I'm gonna drag some of that blue. And I'm just gonna sort of mix it like you would with maybe acrylic paint or oil paint. And the more water you add, it will sort of dilute it a little bit more. And so let's see what that looks like. Yeah, so we're getting that nice purple tone. So you are able to mix colors with these as well. You don't have to work with only the colors that you are given. Maybe if I wanted my purple to be a little bit darker, I would add a little bit more blue. And so if you have only red and you're wanting to make pink or something, just try adding more water rather than trying to mix colors, right? So we can get those light blues and those really sort of rosy colors if we just use water. Water will be our biggest friend for this project. So I'm sort of just blending it out a bit, really dragging that color out to get like a nice lavender. I just took a little bit of red and some blue to get a lavender color. One other rule of watercolors that I want to quickly go over is the cleanup. So we need to clean our brushes properly, and so make sure you have a cup of water nearby, and then when you are done with your paintbrush, swirl it in that water. My water turned blue because I was using blue paint. And we dap it, and then take a paper towel or something and sort of really get out all those colors that we used. So there's a lot of different ways to work with watercolors, and now that we sort of have an understanding of how to make our paints work and the two sort of basic ways of working with watercolor, wet on wet, so wet paper with your wet paintbrush, or dry on wet using a dry paper and having your wet paintbrush do the work. I'm going to show you a few other techniques that might sort of elevate the way your painting looks. So the first technique that I'm going to try is using salt with watercolors. So I'm just using a coarse salt. This is just a coarse sea salt. And I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit on there. And so you'll have to wait until it dries, but there's a chemical reaction that happens with the salt, and it sort of expands in certain areas. So if you can see in the video, there's these areas where that salt landed where it's darker now. So this technique could be helpful if you're doing maybe a night sky or something that has a lot of details of circles and things. And rather than just going in and painting all of those, you could sprinkle salt to get those effects instead. So I've made another color swatch, and this technique I'm going to show you is using plastic wrap. So you can sort of crinkle it up. Don't need a piece that big. And then when your painting is still wet, you can lay it down on top of it and sort of get those nice crinkles in. And so you can sort of see the different tones that are being created by where that plastic is being laid and pressed down onto it. And so I will leave that there until it dries, and then I can lift it up, and those marks will be left there. So another technique that you can do with watercolors is using rubbing alcohol. So just any sort of rubbing alcohol that you have. So I have a Q-tip, and I'm just going to dip my Q-tip into the rubbing alcohol, and then I'm going to slightly dab where my watercolor is. So again, there's that chemical reaction happening that is taking that color. Another method that you can use with watercolors is wax resist. This is one of my favorite ways to work with watercolor. You just take a crayon. I'm going to use a white crayon for this. And so I'm going to just sort of draw a design. And so when I'm doing my wax resist, the part that I'm drawing with the crayon is the part that I don't want covered in paint. So I have that wax down, and then I'm going to take my paint and go over it. So as you can see, that the paint is not going down where I put the crayon. So those swirls are starting to come through. And then one final way of working with watercolor that I'm going to show you is just sort of creating a splatter. So you may want to do this if you're doing a night sky or anything, but you sort of just have some paint on your paintbrush and you slightly just sort of flick the bristles. This is a messy one, so make sure that you are doing this in a space where you can clean it up in. Okay, so my paper has dried, and this is sort of what I was left with. I should have, my salt one, you can sort of see where the salt dried. I did not leave mine alone when I left it there to dry, and I was sort of messing with it. And so the effect, you cannot see it as well as you normally can. So again, you'll want to be sure to make sure that your paper is wet if you decide to use the salt one, and that you leave it there until it dries. But this is sort of what the sort of final results were. So doing it on the dry paper, I got that really dark blue. When I did it on wet paper with the wet paintbrush, the blue was a lot lighter. And then another technique, I just did it on the value one, is you can use pen on top of it to sort of add in some extra details. It sort of creates a different sort of style. And then whenever I mix the red and the blue, and again, that salt that didn't turn out very well. And then the plastic wrap, so I messed with that one as well. And you might need to add a bit more water. And so the more water that you add, those areas will be lighter. And then the rubbing alcohol, the wax resist, and then the splatter, if you can see it. It looks a little bit different in person.